Today I'm going to show you how to make these quilted drawstring bucket bags. This is my latest sewing pattern. They all have internal pockets and they come in 3 different sizes. So we've got the small bag here, which I like to keep. At the moment I've got a mini embroidery project on the go. The pockets are optional inside, you don't have to add them, you can just have it as a big bucket bag. This would also be a really cute little handbag. It fits my phone easily, and then you could just carry it around like this, or you could extend the drawstring ties and have it going over your shoulder, or add a separate little strap. So that is the small size. And then the medium I've been using as my makeup bag recently, but it'd also be good for sewing projects and knitting projects. As you can see, it's got the pockets inside, which are really handy, and they look really sweet just sat on the side, and they stand up on their own. And then finally we had the larger size, which I think is probably going to be the most popular size, but I'm keeping my knitting stuff in here at the moment. I'm not a huge knitter, but when I do, Florrie also likes to join in, and let's just say I've got quite a few balls of yarn that are really not balls anymore. So this is perfect. I'm never going to leave yarn out again for the little dog to destroy. I made a tiny little polka dot one the other day, which is very sweet. My fabric recommendations are all in the instruction booklet, but I thought I'd just chat through my favourites. So you'll have an outer wadding and lining fabric for these. This large bag is made in a cotton poplin, and I think this is probably the best fabric to use. It's really nice to quilt. It has a sort of crisp texture to it, so this top stands up nicely. And then on the inside I line it with a pre-shrunk calico, which is thicker than the outside fabric. I wouldn't use 2 medium weight fabrics. I would use 1 lightweight and 1 medium weight, or just 2 of the same. You could do it all in cotton poplin. So yeah, when thinking of fabrics to choose, cotton poplin is definitely a good choice to go for. But if you want that structure to the bag, having a calico sort of fabric in the lining really helps keep the bag standing upright. But I think the bag would equally look really beautiful if you used lightweight fabric all over, and then it would just kind of crumple down a little bit more or be a bit softer. So it's obviously completely personal preference. I feel like I say this with every pattern I bring out, but I really have been using these non-stop. I think I'll probably make another medium one in this really nice cotton poplin fabric. So anyway, I'm going to get on and show you how I make these quilted drawstring bucket bags. As always, we start by printing the pattern. This can be done at home on A4 or US letter paper, or you can have the large scale document printed at your local printers. If you're printing at home, you will need to trim the side and bottom of each page so that you can match up the registration marks. I then use some clear parcel tape to hold all of the pages together. And then we're ready to start making the bag. I always recommend reading through the entire pattern before you make the bag, just so that you can sort of visualise the steps that you're going to have to do. But to start with, we're going to be cutting the outer and wadding around 2 centimetres larger than the paper pattern, and then the lining around 4 centimetres larger than the paper pattern. Having the lining slightly larger will prevent it from moving out of place when you quilt. So we're quilting the main body of the bag and the base. You can do these as separate pieces. I've just done them as one big rectangle here. The wadding I use has a fusible side, and I fuse it to the outer fabric, and then I just keep the lining as in place as possible with pins. Once I've pinned all 3 layers together, I then decide on the quilted design I want to do. For this one I did diagonal lines. I would recommend quilting reasonably close together because it just makes the construction of the bag a little bit easier. I'd say the maximum distance between the stitch lines I do is 3 centimetres or 1 inch. I use an attachment on my sewing machine foot that acts as a guide for the previous stitch line, but you could also draw on the design in an erasable pen or chalk or even pencil. I switch my machine to setting 4 so the stitch length is quite long, and quilt that way. You can also quilt by hand if you don't want to quilt on your machine. Once I've finished the quilting, I take it over to my iron and give it a really good press. Then I put the paper pattern pieces back on top, pin them into place and cut them out. If you've got a specific print direction, make sure you take note of where the top of the bag is. Once you've cut your quilted pieces, take note of all the notches. These will be really important later on. I like to just cut in a little tiny bit, about 0.3 of a centimetre, but you could also mark them with pen or pencil. If you want to add a label to your bag, I would add it now, especially if you want to stitch it along the bottom of the bag, because you're going to be adding a pocket on top and then it'll be really tricky to stitch it on. But if you want to add it near the top, then you can add it later on. And then go ahead and cut out your remaining pattern pieces in your outer fabric. Now we're going to work on the pocket, so find your pocket piece and we're going to fold over the top towards the wrong side of the fabric by 1 centimetre and press that. Then we're going to fold it again by another 1 centimetre and press that flat. Then we're going to edge stitch all the way along that top seam. Then we're going to take the main quilted section for the bag and we're going to have it with the lining facing us, and we're going to place the pocket wrong side facing the lining at the bottom of the bag. There should be a centre notch that you can match both of them up to. You can pin the pocket into place and then we're going to stitch around the sides and bottom of the pocket with a 0.5 centimetre or 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now we're going to decide where we want the pocket compartments to be. So you can use the guide on the paper pattern piece. I've just used that here and I've just traced it off, but you can add more or fewer compartments, whatever you fancy. But I continue the line of the compartment all the way up to the top of the bag, so when I stitch it just looks like another quilted stitch line. So using the same stitch length I used for my quilting right at the start, I stitch along those pocket guidelines that I just made. We're going to attach the main body of the bag together now, so just fold it in half, good sides facing, and we're going to stitch down the side seam with a 1 centimetre seam allowance. Then using some of your bias trim, we're going to place it on the edge of the seam and stitch it on. We're just going to follow the same stitch line we created in the previous step. We're going to fold the bias trim to meet the edge of the seam and then fold it over on top of the seam to cover any raw edges. I like to clip pin the bias trim so that it covers the seam and then edge stitch down the open end of the bias trim. Now I'm going to attach the base of the bag to the main body of the bag, and to do this we're going to match up those 4 notches. So I start by matching the notches first and then I go ahead and work my way around the circle. I like to use clip pins. You can use normal pins, but they're just super handy. If you're struggling to fit the circle into the base, you can add a really long stitch all the way around the edge, like a gathering stitch, and pull it and it will help ease it into the bag a little bit more. So once we've got the base pinned into place, we can go ahead and stitch all the way around with a 1 centimetre seam allowance. Make sure you're taking your time with this step. Just do a few stitches at a time, then place your needle in the fabric, lift the foot up, manipulate the fabric so it's flat, and then carry on stitching. Do a few stitches, needle down, and carry on. We then need to cover the seams we've just created, so I take my bias trim and I open up one end and fold it over, and I place that end against the edge of the seam and pin that into place. I then work my way around the circle, pinning it into place. And then when I reach the end, I just overlap the bias trim by about 4 centimetres. And again, just stitch that on all the way around, following the same stitch line that you've just created. Then you want to fold the bias trim over the seam allowance and pin it into place. Where you had the fold and the 2 bits of bias trim connecting, you can open them up and then sort of refold them down together and fold it over, and you get a nice clean edge. So once you pin the bias trim into place, you can edge stitch that on your machine, or if you're really struggling to do this on your machine, you can also stitch it on by hand. Now we're going to make the drawstring top section. So we're going to start by placing right sides facing, making sure the notches are meeting at the sides. And then with a 2cm seam allowance, we're going to stitch the short edges together, stopping at the notch. I like to draw on a 2cm seam allowance just to be a bit more accurate, and I can also take note with a pencil where to stop stitching. Once we've stitched those two pieces together, take it over to your iron and press open the seam. And we're going to fold that side seam allowance under by 1cm or 3/8 of an inch and give it a press. And then we're going to edge stitch down the ends of those folds all the way up and down the sides. Then with the wrong side of the fabric facing me, I'm going to fold up the bottom edge of the drawstring top section by 1cm. So this is the open end that we're folding up. I have this little ruler that I can iron on top of, which is quite handy with seam allowance, but you could just eyeball it or use a ruler. Now this next step, follow carefully because it can be a little bit confusing. So the drawstring top section needs to have the good side facing you, as does the main body of the bag. The drawstring section needs to have the open end facing down into the bag, and we need to match up the side notches at the top of the bag to the side seams on the drawstring top section. So place that drawstring top section inside the bag with the good side of the drawstring top section facing the lining inside the bag. We're going to pin this into place and then stitch all the way around. Once that's stitched on, I pull the drawstring top section up out of the bag. You then want to fold the top over towards the outside of the bag, and it should meet just over the seam created in the previous step. And then I just use normal pins to pin that into place all the way around, making sure the fabric isn't twisted. So I match up the side seam when I fold it over. I make sure the side seam is all sitting straight. So once that's been pinned into place, I then turn the bag inside out because it's much easier to stitch this way, and I edge stitch the folded section flat against the main body of the bag, so just over that stitch line. Once you've stitched all the way around, you can add a parallel row of stitching 0.5 centimeters away from that previous stitch line. When you're stitching near the opening of the side seams on the drawstring top section, I like to add a few back tack stitches just to make sure it stays nice and strong when you're pulling the drawstring bag open and closed. Then we're going to add a final row of parallel stitching 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch away from the edge of the top fold. And again, make sure to add those back tack stitches at the side seams. Once you've finished stitching the seams on the drawstring top section, take it over to your iron and give it a good press at the top of the bag. So nearly finished with the bag, we just have the ties to make now. You can use a pre-made trim if you want instead of making the ties, but if you want to know how to make the ties, you just simply iron the piece in half, open it back out, iron the long edges in to meet the middle, and then fold all of that on top of itself and edge stitch down the open end. And then I like to give it a good press once I've finished stitching both of those. Then using a safety pin or a threading tool, I thread one tie through the right side all the way around the bag, and then I repeat with the second tie, threading it through the left side and go all the way around the bag. You can then tie the ends in a knot, or you could stitch the ends together with a 1 centimetre seam allowance, trim down to about 0.5, and then I like to turn that seam allowance in on itself, almost a bit like a French seam, I guess, and then stitch it closed, encasing that seam allowance at the end of the trim. And there you have your finished bag. I really hope you guys have enjoyed this pattern. I think it's such a nice little make. Once you've done the quilting, it actually all comes together pretty quickly. So it's a lot less daunting to sew than it looks. I really hope you guys enjoy the new pattern as much as I do. If you want to see some of the bags I've made with the pattern or other people's bags, then check out my Instagram account. I will leave it link down below. Let me know what you guys would use these bags for and which size you think is your favourite. I hope you're all having a great day, and I will see you in my next video.